As you all know, VCSQI merged in the cardiology specialty into our group about 2 years ago, 2 to 2.5 years ago. A lot of the groundwork thus far has been devoted to just building the database, getting the quality initiative started, looking at angiogram reviews and starting that process. But at this point, this will be our first real look and a keynote from a cardiologist's perspective on appropriateness at a VCSQI meeting. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Dr. David Sain, one of our board members from Carilion, Roanoke, who will introduce tonight's guest speaker. Dr. Sain.
Thank you, Eddie. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Greg Dehmer, who is an interventional cardiologist by practice. He's a renowned academician, published well over 200 papers. Prior chief of cardiology at Baylor Scott & White, which is a very large system down in Texas. I think 80,000 employees, 16 hospitals, something like that. And also a guideline writer for cardiology, including ACCHA and SCI. He knows the NCDR inside and out and was on the management board of that organization for about 8 years. So we were really lucky that he came to Carilion in May of this past year, and just in the past 6 months has already made very strong contributions to our quality efforts. And we're very delighted to have him with us. And tonight he's going to speak on the AUC.
Thank you, David. So I know y'all are running a little bit behind, so I'm going to try to speed this up a little bit. I'm going to keep my eye out for Eddie. If I see Eddie going like this, I know I'm not going fast enough, right, Eddie? So I'm going to tell a story. And like any reporter for a newspaper, they always talk about the 5 W's, who, what, when, where, and why, okay? I couldn't come up with 5 W's. I came up with 4 W's to really characterize the development of the appropriate use criteria, which is something I've been working on since about 2007, actually, a long time. So why were these developed? Who developed these? Where are we now? And where are we going? So disclosures, I wish I got money for this, I don't. So I have been the co-chair of the entire AUC task force, which is now morphed into another committee. I had the privilege of being on the writing group for the AUCs ever since they first started. As like David said, I was on the management board for 8 years. And I do the NCDR public reporting. I'm the chair of the advisory group for that. And the bottom little thing there, I'm required to show by the American Board of Internal Medicine. I'm one of the bad guys that writes the test questions. I don't think there's anybody here who's going to be taking the interventional cardiology boards coming up, but if you are, you ain't getting any of the answers from me tonight. Let's put it that way. So I call this slide the preface to why, okay? You know, I've given a lot of AUC talks over the last 10 years, and it never fails that somehow, somewhere in the audience afterwards, somebody comes up to me and says, why have you guys done this? It's like, I have enough to worry about. I already have too many mandates and regulations, and I love Gary Larson, so you'll have to put up with that. But you know, there's cardiology. You put a target on us, and it's called the AUC. Why have you done that? Because now I've got something else that is out there and people have to pay attention to and I have to pay attention to, and it's a burden. Well, here's why. The preface to the why, though, is for everybody to realize that it's not just cardiology, okay? This is appropriate use criteria for orthopedic surgery, but you didn't know that these existed, right? This is for repair of an anterior cruciate ligament tear. And you can see over here, I think this is the point, yeah. They have simple indications, and how you fill this in determines whether or not you get an autograft or an allograft. So orthopedic surgery has appropriate use criteria. Who knew, right? Dermatology. Dermatology has appropriate use criteria. This is for Mohs surgery, and that's where they burn stuff off your face. And They use the green, yellow, and red, kind of the traffic light approach to this as well. They have appropriate use criteria. Oh, and let's not forget about our colleagues in radiology. They've been doing appropriate use criteria for 25 years. 25 years. And they even morph over into cardiology-related ones. This is all the ones related to, it's a little small to see, but these are all related to cardiac diagnoses. If you want to see what they look like, this is the one, and this is their wording. I don't know where they come up with this wording. This is for chronic chest pain, non-cardiac etiology unlikely. Well, it's like a double negative. And in the usual kind of radiologic hedge terms, usually appropriate, maybe appropriate, and usually not appropriate. And the one thing they add is actually the radiation level. With these little characters, the radiation symbol there. So radiology has done these. And lastly, all the nurses in the audience will appreciate this. Do you know there are AUCs for Foley catheters? I see somebody shaking their head, yes, they knew this, and yes, there are. This is the Ann Arbor criteria, appropriate urinary catheter use, and they use the same methodology that I'll be telling you about a little bit later that we use in the cardiology AUC. So it's not just cardiology that's come up with this. There's a lot of groups that have done AUCs. So why do we have the AUCs? Dr. Rich made some comments to start, which were really very helpful, and I'm going to kind of share some of the same things with you. I think you would have had to been sleeping under a cabbage leaf or something to not realize that the U.S. spends an enormous amount on healthcare. This is what we spend on healthcare, about $10,300 per person, and that's more than any of these other well-developed countries, Switzerland, Germany, Netherlands, and so forth. So we spend a lot of money on healthcare. One way to look at this, it has to be scaled for the size of the economy, and the typical way to do that is to relate it to the gross domestic product. The GDP is basically just a measure of all the goods and all the services generated over a period of time by a particular country. It's a measure of the size of your economy. Even if you scale it for our economy, here's the US, way over here. This is not a contest that we want to win, but now we're spending, the latest numbers, and they're always a couple years old, 17.8% of all of the money that we spend is spent on healthcare. That's a lot. It's a lot compared to these other countries that you see here. Where do we spend the money? This is interesting data from the Economic Cooperation and Development Organization. Look at the US here. We have more MRI units. We have more MRI exams, more CT scanners, more CT exams. We do more coronary bypass, and the whole thing. More. And so you wonder where we spend our money. We spend our money on a lot of these procedures. Now, this is an older slide, and I'm showing this on purpose because remember, we're walking through the whole story of the AUC and how we got to the AUC in the first place. So this is from 2009, okay, so just about 10 years old. But it shows the growth of imaging since 2000. And imaging is this red one here on the top, and it has grown faster than any other modality compared with E&M services and other things. Well, why is that? Well, we have tremendous technological advances now in terms of what we can. We have things like PET scans and all these other great tests, and physicians want to use them. Defensive medicine. I can promise you that if you say, I really got this bad headache, and it just started a couple hours ago, and you go into the emergency room, you're going to leave with a CT scan. And that's just defensive medicine. We have empowered patients. I still have people come in with an article from, who knows where, but it says, hey, there's this new imaging test. Do you think I need this new imaging test to tell me if my heart's okay? We have empowered patients, and one cannot deny the fact there are financial incentives for the imager. There have been several studies out there that show that if you own a CT scanner, you're going to do more CT scans. You got to pay for it somehow. Now, if you're a provider, you say, well, this is good because these are fantastic tests and they help me make better patient care decisions. Absolutely true. If you're a payer, you just look at this because this is just a big price tag item. These things are very expensive. Who has not heard that we spend a lot of money on drugs in the United States? Here we are down here over $1,000 a year on drugs, and way higher than most of these other well-developed countries. We're not talking third world countries, we're talking very well-developed economies here. So there's good news and bad news. I think Dr. Rich actually just mentioned this a little bit. The good news is the growth is slowing. This article was from Health Affairs last year. It's actually written by economists at CMS. So the growth is slowing. It's down to 5.6%. That's the good news. The bad news is it's still growing. And it's estimated that by 2025, the amount we spend on healthcare will approach 20% of all of our economic spending. I really like this graph. This is from the former chair of the Council of Economic Advisors. If something cannot go on forever, it'll stop. And here's where we are right now. This is about 2017, 2018, 2019, and we're spending somewhere around 18, 20% right now. Now, the growth has slowed, but you can't get up to a point where you're spending 50% of all the money and goods and services generated on one item, and that's healthcare. What about defense spending? What about infrastructure? What about all these other things that we need to spend money on as a government? It has to stop somewhere. Don Berwick was the former head of CMS until, I guess, politics got in the way. And he did an analysis that was published in JAMA in 2012. His numbers are actually pretty similar. Again, on this graph, this is the healthcare spending as a percentage of gross domestic product. And you can see here's about 19.5, and that's where we are now. But he went a step farther. He broke it down into all of these different areas: fraud and abuse, overtreatment. I won't even talk about administrative complexity. But, you know, we're talking serious money here. These are billions of dollars, and this overtreatment or overuse. And what Berwick said is unintended variation is stealing healthcare blind. And remember that, because we're going to talk more about that in a little bit. You know, I thought I had this talk all put together, but I added this slide just for emphasis. He's talking about overtreatment. This was published on Tuesday in the Journal of the, or JAMA Internal Medicine. You can see the title, 2018 Update on Medical Overuse. 3 of the 7 things highlighted in this article fell underneath the cardiology umbrella. Unnecessary EKGs. This is, you know, you go in every year, the doctor orders an EKG on you and says, well, it looks pretty good, it didn't change. Unnecessary. Routine lipid panels in statin-treated patients. Now, I'm not trying to say you should never get a lipid panel in a statin patient, but this is, well, we're going to check your lipids every 6 months whether you need it or not. And it doesn't really affect therapy. And the last is high sensitivity troponin testing. Now, don't get me wrong, this is a phenomenal test, but it generates a lot of other extra tests that follow. Why does this patient have an elevated troponin? And sometimes it's just not that big a deal. So, very current, this overuse. Some of you may have seen this slide before. I see a few heads going up and down, and hopefully that's not because they're falling asleep, but it's from the Dartmouth Atlas, and it looks at the variation in PCI utilization across the United States. And remember, Berwick says this unintended variation is stealing us blind. Medicare has 306 hospital referral regions, and every one of those little irregular shapes on the map, on this map. This looks at the PCI rates per 1,000 Medicare patients across the United States. And you see it's not a homogeneous picture, all sorts of different colors here. The darker the color, the higher the rate of utilization. And since it's normalized for 1,000 Medicare enrollees, the fact that there's a lot more retired people in Florida and Arizona, no, that all kind of cancels out. So tremendous variation. Another way to look at this is shown on this slide, a little easier to understand. This is the same data, just shown a little bit differently. This is on a scale here where 1 over here represents very little variation. This procedure is hip fracture repair. So, if you fall down and you bust your hip, you don't have a lot of choices. Either get it fixed or you spend the rest of your life immobile until it heals. Not a lot of choices. So there's not much variation. The one highlighted in red here is PCI. Tremendous variation, high and low variation across the 306 Medicare service areas. So, why is it so variable? Now, U.S. News and World Report took the same data, and this is from 2009. And again, remember, I'm trying to build a story to set the stage for the AUC. 2009, in the U.S., the average was 2.6 PCIs for every cabbage that was done. That's the average across the country. Why is it that in Davenport, Iowa, 13.8 PCIs are done for every cardiac or every bypass operation? Why are there like 3 from Iowa, 3 from Ohio, all in this list? Why are these areas so much higher than the rest of the country? Now, maybe the people there are just sicker, right? I mean, that could be, and that's one thing, and that's what the appropriate use criteria will help you do. So, why? Why were these developed? Well, part of it was to explore and reduce this variation of care, which is stealing healthcare blind, to contain costs by defining appropriate care and hopefully minimize overuse. And then finally, you have to be pretty honest, it was self-serving, because better we police ourselves as healthcare providers before somebody else imposes further restrictions. Now, surgeons have a tool that they use to cut. It makes very precise cuts. It's called a scalpel, okay? Very precise, very clean cuts. When the government makes cuts, they have a different tool. It's called a machete. And there's a lot of collateral damage when this is done. So you have to be very careful. So how do you want these cuts made? Because we have to cut. You want a scalpel or you want a machete? So let's move on. Who developed these things? What defines quality in healthcare? I want everybody in the room to start thinking about how they would define quality in healthcare. They won't all be the same, okay? They will not all be the same. We're going to take a little sidebar here. We're also going to talk about some lessons that we've learned, some hard falls we've taken with the AUC development. We're going to talk about how they've changed, and then we're going to address some misconceptions while you're thinking about how you would define quality. The little sidebar here is to talk about this case at the Supreme Court. This is Jacobellis versus the state of Ohio. So you have to remember, this got to the Supreme Court in '64. You don't get there as a first step. You go through multiple steps to get there. So this started about 1961, 62 in Ohio, where this Nico Jacobellis was the manager of this theater, and he got fined $2,500 from his local county court because he showed this French film titled The Lovers. You can kind of get the idea, right? Okay, which the state deemed as obscene. And he appealed, and this went to this appeals court. It eventually went to the Ohio Supreme Court, and then to the National Supreme Court. And Justice Potter Stewart, who felt was famous in his opinion, who felt the Constitution protected all obscenity except, quote, hardcore obscenity. Now, you can imagine, this film back then was considered obscene. It'd probably be PG right now compared to our standards. But Justice Stewart wrote, "I shall not today attempt to further define the kinds of material I understand to be embraced within that shorthand description referring to hardcore pornography. And perhaps I could never succeed in intelligently doing so, but I know it when I see it." And the motion picture involved in this case is not that. "I know it when I see it" is that phrase which has lingered on and which he's really kind of become famous for. So it's like, it's hard to define quality, but you know it when you see it. That's Robert Pirsig. Now, Robert Pirsig's an interesting guy. How many ever saw the movie A Beautiful Mind about John Nash, right? Brilliant guy, also schizophrenic, okay? Robert Pirsig, brilliant guy, also schizophrenic. And he wrote this book. He only wrote 2 books in his lifetime, but this one's called Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. Really doesn't have anything to do with motorcycle maintenance, but it's all about defining quality. And he wrote, quality is an experience that's hard to define, but you know it when you experience it. So kind of think about that. So how do I define a quality haircut, right? This is how I define it. I can walk in and I don't have to wait. The person that cuts my hair is fast. I don't like a lot of conversation, and it doesn't cost a lot. That's my quality haircut, okay? Now that may not be how you define a quality haircut, but that's how I define a quality haircut. So it's an experience. So this goes way back to 2004 when ACC and Sky got together and they were trying to develop this quality improvement toolkit for cath labs. And you can see a cath kit, improving the quality in cardiac cath labs. An interesting group, you probably can't read all the names there, but 3 ACC presidents, including the current president, Mike Valentine, 2 Sky presidents were on this particular writing group. So, you think back, a long time ago is how were people defining quality? Well, they just counted up the number of cases. Well, we did a lot of cases and therefore we must be better, and that's quality. Well, not really. It's more than just counting up how many complications you have. And in fact, in this introduction to the article, we had a phrase that really defined appropriateness. Simply put, completing 500 coronary interventions without a single complication does not equate to quality if 450 of the procedures were performed with poor indications on lesions that would best be left alone, right? That's not quality. Quality has to include the appropriateness of doing the procedure. That was in early 2004. The ACC president at the time was Michael Wolk, and he picked up on this concept. And in one of his president's pages in Jack wrote, "The appropriate cardiology, responsible stewardship in the golden era of cardiology." And that was kind of the early nudge that got the AUC rolling, along with the concerns about how costs would be controlled, and it's better we would control the costs than have somebody control the costs for us. The actual methodology used comes from the RAND Corporation. They're out on the West Coast. And there's an appropriate use manual that you can actually download. If any of you had trouble sleeping tonight, I'd suggest this as your reading material. It's about 280 pages long, but it's the whole appropriate method laid out. Within that is something called the Delphi Method. And this is back in the 50s. What happens with the Delphi Method, you solicit opinions from experts who anonymously reply to carefully designed questions and subsequently receive feedback in the form of statistical representation of the group response, after which the process repeats itself. It's not an attempt to get everybody into groupthink. What it is it's a way to try to condense and consolidate opinions. And the goal is really to reduce the range of responses and arrive at a convergence of opinion. That's the Delphi method. And that's what was adopted and used from the very beginning, and still is used, as the appropriate use criteria were developed. What you see on the left is the third version of the appropriate use methodology, which was published earlier this year. We're going to first talk, though, about the bottom part here, which is the terminology. The current terminology, appropriate, maybe appropriate, and rarely appropriate, is not what we started with. In fact, when this started, and in the first document, 2005, which was on imaging, these 3 terms were used: appropriate, uncertain, and inappropriate. those terms were used because that's exactly the terminology in the Delphi methodology. That got changed in 2013 to the current terms. It's an interesting story. Anybody recognize this picture? Anybody recognize where that picture came from? Well, it's from the 1931 movie Frankenstein. And if you remember the story, Frankenstein creates this monster, he's terrorizing the town, and finally towards the end of the movie, all the townspeople band together and the monster's been chased out to the castle, and they run out and they're going to burn the castle down, destroy the monster, right? Actually, that's not where that picture is taken. That picture was taken, that picture was really taken outside of the Chicago Hilton Hotel at the ACC meeting in 2012. And that group is not the townspeople, that's the ACC Board of Governors who are confronting the task force about the term inappropriate. Would you want to be called inappropriate? No. I mean, you know, hindsight's always 20/20, and they were pretty adamant. They did not like the word inappropriate because they felt like, they're getting called inappropriate for doing these procedures. And they even went so far as to hire a media consultant who was pretty specific that was really a dumb choice to use that word, inappropriate, but it was used because that's what was in the Delphi methodology. See the guy, the red dot back there? That's actually the ACC governor from Virginia at the time. I don't know if you can recognize him or not, but he was in that angry crowd, I can promise you. It was an interesting meeting, but it led to the change in the terminology. Part of their angst, if you will, came from this paper, which was published in 2011. So remember, that meeting was in 2012. This paper came out in JAMA in 2011. And it's really, what does the appropriateness look like? It was the first look at appropriateness of PCI in the US based on the appropriate use document. That was the 2009 document. So, like what happens with a lot of high-profile presentations and papers, it's released to the press under an embargo before it ever is published. So this got to the Wall Street Journal, embargoed. So on the same date that this paper was released, July the 6th, 2011, the Wall Street Journal published the results. What did the study show? Well, they took all these PCIs, about 500,000 PCIs, 71% were acute, STEMI, non-STEMI, high-risk unstable angina. The rest were elective non-acute PCIs. And here's what it showed. And this graphic is actually from the Wall Street Journal. I use this because it's a pretty good graphic to show the results. Here's the 71% of the cases which were high risk, STEMI, non-STEMI. 98.6% of the time the procedure was appropriate. That's pretty high. Why is it so high? Well, we've got very good guidelines that tell us how we should treat patients, and that PCI is an appropriate thing to do if you're having a STEMI or a high risk unstable angina situation. In the minority of the patients, which was 29%, 50% were appropriate, 38% were of uncertain benefit, and 11% were graded as inappropriate. Now, the uncertain benefit, what does that mean? Well, it means that they're kind of a class 2 in guideline terminology. I mean, there's mixed data, there's not enough data, or there's just a divergence of opinion about this. So that's the way it fell out. If you added all this up, there were only 4.1% of the cases actually were scored as inappropriate. Personally, I thought that was pretty good. And what was really came out in the study is exactly what Don Berwick was talking about with the unintended variation. Every hospital is going to have, and every operator will have some cases that are graded as rarely appropriate or inappropriate. And they do that because of what I term a failure to capture. What do I mean by that? Well, there are only so many variables that we could put into the algorithm for appropriate use. We actually it's a binary calculation. We actually estimated how many there would be if we put everything in there, like age and ejection fraction and all those kinds of things. It would have been an appropriate use document as thick as the New York City phone book, which would not be helpful to any clinician. So we had to eliminate some things. So it's failure to capture. The other thing is lack of evidence. There's just some patient subsets where there's not enough evidence to definitively say this is the best treatment. And you can see that variation here. There were some hospitals that had very high number of inappropriate procedures, but most hospitals were in around the 10% range. So everybody's going to have a few inappropriates or rarely appropriates now. Well, that's not exactly how the press took this study. They ran with it, and this is U.S. News and World Reports. Study finds most urgent angioplasties warranted. Well, that's true, right? It was like 99% almost. But in the fine print here, only half of non-emergency artery opening procedures are deemed appropriate. Well, that's true as well, but the implication is that all the other ones are wrong, right? Which is wrong. Bloomberg News. Now, this came a couple of years after that, but look at this headline. Half of cardiac stent procedures overused and unnecessary. That paper never said that, right? That's not what the paper said, but they have imputed, across the board, half of them are unnecessary. And look at this particular headline. Mother dies amid abuses in $110 billion U.S. stent assembly line. If you actually trace this back, it's pretty interesting. That's the headline, and you can Google this, and you can find that exact article, and it's immediately followed by about 25 different things that Google finds, which are law firms. First one happens to be the Mahoney Law Firm, and of course they're offering to come after you if your stent was unnecessary. And all of this, if you really dig into it, it was a renal artery stent. It wasn't even a coronary stent. Now, it doesn't excuse the patient's death, but, poor interventional cardiologists are kind of getting lambasted here over something that they really were not responsible for. But this unwanted variation gets attention. This is the case of that hospital on the coast of Maryland, where they brag that they did more PCIs than any place in Maryland, and it led to a congressional investigation by the Finance Committee. Even in Lancet, they're publishing articles and opinion pieces. U.S. physicians urge to end unnecessary stent operations. There's cartoons. I don't know if you can read the caption. All of your labs are back. They show a serious overuse of unnecessary and inappropriate tests and procedures. And this is a real billboard. This is not Photoshop. Any of you have ever seen this in a slide before, this billboard? It's real. It was in Pennsylvania when all of this was churning away. How'd you like to see that driving to work every day if you're an interventional cardiologist? And it's become big news. This is the New York Times article about the hospital chain in Florida that got into trouble. There's Auburn, Alabama, ACP internists, unneeded stents become a criminal offense, and there's people in jail now for Medicare fraud for doing this. U.S. News and World Reports hop back in 2015. Doctors, you can read the headlines. I don't need to read them to you. You get the idea. This is, we're under the microscope for this. But more and more scrutiny. AARP, this has been out there for a while. 4 surgeries to avoid stents for stable angina. But most of all, you are in big trouble, really big trouble, when Dr. Oz gets on television. Now, clearly the man has he's a cardiac surgeon, by the way, so he has absolutely no bias in his opinion. But when Dr. Oz gets on television, you can read the headline, I don't need to read it to you. You're in big trouble. So, How are the AUC developed? Well, another one of my cartoons here, heads you get a quadruple bypass, tails you take a baby aspirin. It's a little more complicated than that. So we've talked about the terminology. What about the rest of it? Well, there's a writing group, and the writing group comes up with all those little snippets or those little scenarios after an extensive literature review and guideline mapping. That gets reviewed by a lot of people, and you have to answer all the criticisms. And then the rating panel comes together. The rating panel is actually the group that votes on what the appropriateness rating is. And the first round is done independently. It's a ballot that they receive. And then you come together for a group meeting. Now, a lot of people have been critical of the rating panel, saying, who are these guys that do this rating? It's a limited number of people. You can't read the names here, but it's a balanced group. An equal number of surgeons, interventional cardiologists, and then a slightly greater number of just regular cardiologists or outcomes researchers that do not do revascularization procedures. And people malign the rating panel as being, stilted, unfair bias. But there's two other rating panels you could have considered. These two, Congress or the insurance companies. And I think you get the idea. They're not, you think the doctors on there are going to be biased. No, these guys are really going to be biased. So here's actually a picture of what it looks like at a rating panel meeting, and no, it's not the surgeons on one side of the table and the cardiologists on the other throwing spitballs at each other. That's really not like that. It is an intense 2-day working session where each one of these indications is discussed and the initial votes are discussed and people kind of work their way through all this. And everybody goes home and you do another round of ballots. And we've now developed an electronic voting form. It used to be all on paper. And that's how you wind up with the final ratings. So what does the appropriate use criteria allow you to do? Well, we showed this map earlier, the darker colors being the higher use areas, but the map doesn't tell you if there's overuse in the high areas or if there's underuse in the low areas. In order to do that, you need some kind of benchmark. You need a yardstick upon which to compare things. And that's what the appropriate use criteria does, is it provides that yardstick. A couple of misconceptions. Everybody always says the appropriate use criteria are all about cutting down usage. It's about overuse and lowering overuse. That's actually not true. The very first articles that came out using the same methodology were by Dr. Robert Brooke and his group out at Stanford. And basically, it showed the underuse of coronary revascularization in certain populations. The British have also looked at this as an older study, but they looked at patients receiving appropriate or uncertain PCI or CABG. They actually did better than those that had an inappropriate one. Here it's where it's better if it was appropriate. The misconception number 2 is that one should never do a rarely appropriate case. Now, like I said, I've given a lot of AUC talks, and one of the things I like to do is in a big audience, I'll say, all right, how many of the doctors here have ever seen somebody else do a rarely appropriate case? Or how many, actually, I messed that up. How many of the physicians in the room have ever themselves done an inappropriate case? A few hands kind of go up like this, sheepishly. I say, how many of the physicians in the room have seen somebody else do an inappropriate case? 150 hands go up right away. Well, the reality is everybody will occasionally do a rarely appropriate case. I've done it. I'm sure everybody else does too. But what you do not want to see is this. Everybody's going to have some, but whether this is an individual operator, this is a facility, you don't want to see some group standing out as being much larger than the other groups. So AUC is really a population tool as much as an individual tool. Misconception number 3 is they should be used to determine payments. No, 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 no. No, they should not be used to determine payments. These are snippets from multiple different documents that we put together. AUC never intended to determine payments in individual patients. Do not believe a rating of may be appropriate is just to deny, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Should not be doing that. I guess if we're guilty of anything, it's being somewhat naive, because the good folks in the state of New York tried to use this. You can't read all the small print, but back in 2013, in their Medicaid and Medicaid managed care, they basically said, you can do it, but then we're going to go back and we're going to look and see if it was appropriate or not appropriate. If we think it was not appropriate, we want our money back after the fact. Well, fortunately, because of a very strong lobbying effort by Sky and several others, that got suppressed, and it never really happened, although they tried to do it. So where are we right now? Well, what's the place of the AUC? What's the current portfolio look like? We've shifted to multimodality documents, and is there any effect or any evidence that it's working? Well, AUCs have become one of the big 3. I mean, everybody knows about clinical practice guidelines, performance measures, and AUC is kind of now one of the big 3 documents that are out there. Clinical practice guidelines, you know, good and bad. I mean, it's an exhaustive review of the literature, heavy reliance on randomized controlled trials, if there are any. It really defines the best practices. It tells you what you should do and what you should not do and what might harm the patient. The negatives are it's hard to keep the guidelines up to date because things change very rapidly. They don't address areas where there's limited data. It's sometimes difficult to keep the documents coordinated, and limited applications in these very, very complicated patients, which unfortunately are more common than uncommon. Performance measures, you know, if something is so well established, it's a class 1 indication, and it's, you know, it's like etched in stone, it's eligible to become a performance measure. And the difference here is in the title, it's measurable. So this is from one that was recently came out on ST segment elevation, and you can see a performance measure has to be expressed as a %. So like aspirin at discharge, it's the number of your patients that got aspirin over the total number who are candidates for aspirin therapy, and that percentage is a performance score. Well, the AUC portfolio has a whole list of documents, and there's more that are in the queue about to come out. I just found out yesterday that the peripheral artery intervention is actually going to be published, what is that, next week, Monday, I think? But it's going to be published later this month. But you'll notice that there's been a shift to this use of multimodality AUCs. What do I mean by multimodality? Well, here's the, you know, initially there were AUCs for echo, for MR, for CT, for radionuclide. So, you know, here's the busy doctor sitting in their office. What test should I use? Well, I got to go to this document and that document and this document and that. I mean, it wasn't user friendly. So what we've done now is put these in a multimodality form where the little scenarios are over here and multiple different imaging or testing modalities are shown here, so you can go to one document and you can see how they all compare with each other. That's the multimodality format. So the AUCs, is there any evidence they actually do anything? I mean, it's a big exercise. Well, there is. This is actually a study from Canada where they applied the AUC to about 1,600 patients. And what they showed was this. In those patients, 68% had an appropriate reason for revascularization. 18 were uncertain. They're still using the older term in this older document. 14% were inappropriate. If you had an appropriate indication and you went on to have that intervention, you had a better outcome. If it was appropriate and was performed, your outcome variable, death or ACS at 3 years, was lower than if it was not performed. The numbers are smaller. This was not statistically significant, but if you had an inappropriate indication and you go on to have it performed, your outcome is worse than if it was not performed. So there is some evidence that it may help. This is probably the most compelling study. It's from JAMA a couple years ago. They looked at 2.7 million procedures from the NCDR, and you can see the trend here is an increasing rate of appropriate patients and a decreasing rate of inappropriate patients. So certainly there is some evidence that the cost curve is being moved just a little bit. Other evidence here, this is letters. This is also published in JACC. This is actually from Geisinger, and the way their system works is primary care doctors, ACPs, could actually order a cardiac cath, and they were having a lot of people show up, and the cardiologists would go, you don't need a cath. So they entered into a big education program, and they markedly reduced, you can see 17% to less than 1% inappropriate referrals. This is echo reading, which by appropriate education, they got the inappropriate echoes to go down. So, on a small scale, there are indications that we can move the cost curve or the cost benefit needle, but it's hard and it's complicated. And, healthcare is pretty complicated. And if you didn't know that, this guy does. This is from February 17th, where Trump got up and said, nobody knew that healthcare could be so complicated. I knew that. I mean, you all knew that, but it apparently was news to him. So anyhow, it is complicated, so it's hard to show improvements. This is the last section. He's almost done, right? Where is this going? Well, you need to put this on your radar if you don't already know about this. This is the AUC mandate. This is right from a page off the CMS website. Again, this is part of the Protecting Access to Medicare Act, also known as Obamacare, from 2014. And basically, it's to promote the use of AUC for advanced diagnostic imaging. In plain English, if you don't use the AUC, we ain't gonna pay for it. That's what it boils down to. What's affected? Well, MR, CT, nuclear, and PET. Certainly nuclear and CT has major impact for cardiologists. It does not include echocardiography. And they target these high priority clinical areas. Coronary disease is really the one that is most relevant to the cardiology sphere. So the way this works is, now CMS isn't going to develop AUCs. They kind of issue an RFP and have come up, they always come up with their own language. And in this case, they call them provider-led entities. So a provider-led entity is some organization that will produce an AUC document on some topic that meets the CMS requirements. That's what it is. So PLEs are approved to develop their own AUCs. You have to apply to CMS to be a PLE. You have to update it. You can only imagine, this is the government. We're here to help. So there's pages of rules you have to follow. And as of June, there were 20 PLEs out there, including the ACC. So the ACC, all the AUCs for the ACC have been approved as PLEs. So how is this supposed to work? Well, you've got your AUC here, which is basically what we've been talking about. And then there's this thing called the Clinical Decision Support Mechanism. And, I've shown this in a cloud. So I got to tell you, it's a little foggy out there on how this is going to work. But basically, it's an electronic portal through which the clinician, you're sitting there with the patient, you want to order a CT scan. This is like supposed to interact with your medical record. When you order a CT scan, it's supposed to go out there and look for all this stuff that's hidden in your EMR and pull it all together and then tell you if it's appropriate or rarely appropriate to order a CT scan in this circumstance. Right, okay. Well, there's 11 qualified clinical support decision mechanism organizations out there. And what happens is you put in the order, it clears this cloudy mechanism says it's okay, and you get a number. It generates a number. Clinical decision support number, and then that couples with the NPI. Every doctor's got an NPI, and the AUC then, when the bill goes in, you put all that stuff on there and it's approved for payment. What could possibly go wrong, huh? So back in August of last year, we actually tried to pull together a summit up at Hart House above this. And basically, we tried to bring in all the stakeholders. We got CMS actually to come across town and do that. We had family physicians, American College of Physicians, the AMA, Society of General Internal Medicine, all the stakeholders that would be affected. And it was kind of a day-long symposium talking about all this. So the AUC mandate, it's still out there. But the future, I think the future is still pretty uncertain. It's opposed by multiple different organizations. The AMA is against it. The Nuclear Medicine Society, ASNC, is against it. The family physicians are against it. You can imagine how they think their burden is going to increase with all of this. This started when Dr. Tom Price was head of HSS, and I think he flew in too many private jets or something. He's gone. He was against it. There were two interims, and now Alex Azar is the new head of HSS. So it's still in there. It was supposed to go live next month. It's been delayed until January of 2020. Personal prediction, we've talked to the people at CMS. They're doing it because it's the law. They have to do it. There just doesn't seem to be a lot of bubbling enthusiasm on their part to really do a lot. I'm not sure where this will be in January of 2020. A lot of irons in the fire here. That's personal opinion. It's not a prediction. But really this all boils down to self-regulation. It's we as healthcare professionals, as an organization, we have to realize that healthcare is very expensive. It's a huge burden for almost everybody in the population. And it's really, if we don't regulate ourselves, who is going to regulate us? And that's really the spirit of the AUC. There may be another solution. You probably know these guys, right? That Jeff Bezos, Warren Buffett, Jamie Dimon, Amazon, Berkshire Hathaway, JP Morgan. And last year, they said they're going to shake up healthcare and they're going to design a better system free from profit-making incentives and constraints. Of course, it's only for their employees, but that's okay. They employ a lot of people. And Warren Buffett even said, the hungry tapeworm on the American economy, talking about healthcare costs. Even there's an Annals editorial, Starving the Hungry Tapeworm, How Businessmen May Reform Healthcare Costs. Now, I don't know where this thing is going. I haven't heard a lot about this. In July, I know they hired Atul Gawande from Harvard to be their CEO. I still haven't really, it's kind of all happening, I guess, but I really don't know what's going on in the background or if they'll even be successful, but it'll be interesting to see what they come up with. And I think that's it. Thank you. I didn't see Eddie going like this once. Any questions? Left him dumbfounded. All right, thank you.
Actually, the question or comment Mike Contis made to me is how much of the improvement in appropriateness is actually due to better documentation versus actually more appropriate procedures? Or do we know? Can we tell?
It's a great question. We don't know. And the reality is that, everybody would say, are people just gaming the system? Are they calling people that have stable angina, unstable angina, because that gets them into the appropriate category? We don't know, but, we can't be a police person standing in the back of every cath lab to know that. John?
I was just going to add, actually, from the perspective of the focus tool that was in Delaware, when they applied the appropriate use criteria, their volume of cases actually went down. So it wasn't just, retooling and making comments, changing to game the system.